This was a time when the planet gave up on itself. From the vantage point of a satellite, high enough to make out the whole immense globe, but near enough to discern the spine-like mountain ranges, the patchwork forests, the intricate coastlines in our proud cities, from on high like this, it was clear that the world was dimming. The bright blue oceans were grayer, the shining ice sheets at both poles smaller, and the whole thing seemed to turn more slowly in space, as if day and night were growing in length. Like an old dog that has laid down in the road, the planet had run out of steam. Rivers ran only sluggishly, fire raged through parched, empty forest, and every month the tides were weaker. Amidst this, a bank clerk received a phone call from the hospital, informing him that his wife had died. When he'd left the house that morning, she'd planned to visit the doctor, but had only complained of a cold, and he'd thought nothing of it. He stood now on the busy sidewalk outside the bank like a rock in a stream, and went over the call in his head. He had not thought to ask what had happened or what he should do next. He'd simply said, "Thank you for letting me know," and hung up, which he now regretted. He couldn't stay on the sidewalk, jostled on all sides, so he walked home and went over and over his memory of the call, unpacking each word the nurse had used in search of some subtler, less finite message. But there was none. Despite all the things that needed doing, the bank clerk remained stunned for several days and moved through them without speaking. The day after receiving the hospital call, he arrived at work right on time. The surprised branch manager looked at the bank clerk as if his grief might be contagious and said he should take some time off, and the bank clerk only nodded in response. When it was time to make funeral arrangements, he shook his head at many of the options and finally nodded at something that seemed appropriate. He felt, almost literally, as if he was floating a few feet above his own head, following himself through a series of actions that were almost involuntary, like blinking or your heart beating. He signed death certificate forms, sent notes to distant relatives, and stood alone in the white stone mausoleum as her urn was lodged in its resting place. At the same time, things that ought to be involuntary grew more difficult. There were hours when it seemed he had to concentrate only on his breathing, on pulling the air in and pushing it out of himself, or it would stop. Somewhere deep in his subconscious, he wondered, almost without interest, whether this spell, this feeling of ghost walking through his life would ever end. And then the tickets to their cruise arrived. They had been frugal by nature, the bank clerk and his wife. Vacations were rare and usually near home, a night away, maybe two. They mended their sweaters, cooked at home, and like reformed alcoholics who can't be around other drinkers, the bank clerk and his wife avoided spending time with the profligate. People that couldn't save their money seemed sort of helpless to them, like fiends with uncontrollable desires. They were the last sort to make rash purchases, but one day they came across an advertisement for an adventure cruise to see the very last whale in the ocean. In the ad, a blue whale moved with melancholic grace in deep water. A narrator spoke of a final safari and rattled off statistics. The last of the blue whales was a male, 90 feet long and 150 tons. But the bank clerk could only think of how empty the vast ocean must seem, how small even the largest animal on earth must feel when confronted with the depths where sunlight did not penetrate. As the enormous animal glided across the screen, his wife rose out of her seat, reaching down to grasp his forearm. "That's it," she said. "That's what I want to do." They had followed, like everyone else, the slow degradation of the planet. The sea rose inch by inch, whole species of animals disappeared from the earth, and the seasons were replaced with dull gray skies and a muddy air that could turn suddenly, viciously cold and back again. It was all so much, and all happened so quickly, that in bed tonight they often spoke of wanting to do something. But what? Anything they might do would be like throwing a snowball into the sun. The advertisement for the whale safari was like throwing a lit match on Tinder. It wasn't even finished before they began dialing the phone number on the screen. When the tickets arrived, the bank clerk had his first moment of clarity since the fateful call from the hospital. He went to the mausoleum and roused the caretaker. At first, the caretaker wouldn't do as asked. "It's highly irregular," the caretaker said. "They call it a resting place for a reason." But the bank clerk was persistent, and eventually the caretaker couldn't come up with a firm reason to deny him. After a phone call to his superior, the caretaker brought a thin steel bar to the mausoleum, pried back the marble panel that was not yet etched with her name, and handed the bank clerk the dull silver urn of his wife's ashes. The ship was bright white, with a long body and a bridge that bristled with antenna and satellite dishes. Crossing the narrow gangplank, the bank clerk carried only a small duffel, where his wife's urn was swaddled in clothes. Though it was perfectly safe, he had an irrational fear that he might drop the duffel, so he held it close and he stayed in the center of the gangway. Many of the other passengers had large bags, more than seemed necessary for a few days' trip. Many of them also had left rigid black cases with the porters on the dock, only as wide as telephone poles but 8 or 10 feet in length. They had tapered ends that gave them a menacing look, like smallish missiles. He couldn't imagine what they carried. The man in front of the bank clerk on the gangplank had no bags at all, and though he seemed sure of foot, he moved slowly. He had long blonde hair, and he clutched his loose shirt at the chest as if for balance. The bank clerk could feel those behind him growing impatient. At the end of the gangplank, a crewman stood ready to welcome the passengers, but the bondman came to a stop. Someone behind them muttered, "What the hell's going on?" The blond man raised an arm theatrically and looked down the gangplank with a serious and unsettling expression. Being so close to him, the bank clerk was looking right up at his clear blue eyes, and he was startled by their intensity. There seemed to be a light behind them, and the man's lips quivered slightly. As if addressing a great audience, the man said loudly and slowly, "Praise be to God," and stepped aboard. The welcoming crewman looked a little perplexed. "Well, welcome aboard then." The bank clerk didn't consider himself irreligious, but he'd grown tired of these displays. The pious were everywhere these days. In every catastrophe, the storms, earthquakes, and extinctions, the devout heard another shout from God and saw more evidence of their own righteousness. Any gathering or event drew a clutch of them, collected in knots, sometimes small, sometimes massive. Some of them stayed within themselves and swayed to their own music as they prayed. Some of them marched through the unbelievers and shouted slogans from the Bible, mostly about the dire consequences of not following them. It colored everything in public life. His wife would have hated the preacher. Her impatience with all the proselytizing had grown to something like an allergic reaction. Even the mildest display of religion made her hands tremble. A few passengers had approached the blond preacher. He spoke with them, shook their hands, and in a few cases seemed to apply a blessing by laying a hand calmly on their bowed heads. The bank clerk wondered who he was, but resolved to give him a wide berth. The ship left the dock, moved out of the harbor, and the bank clerk moved excitedly along the rail. Many years ago, he and his wife had gone sailing, one of those group day trips that leaves at dawn and returns in the dark. He had never forgotten the bright green color of the sea and the churning froth on the surface that misted their face and arms with each pitch of the hull. He and his wife had laid on their backs. Above them, the impossibly crisp arc of the sails slipped past a sky teeming with gray and white birds. On the return leg, they had sat on the edge, their feet trailing in the cool water, as a pod of slick gray dolphins skimmed along in perfect pace with the boat. But the sea he saw now was altogether different. It was a flat, leaden gray, like mud, lifeless in every direction, and slipped by the hull without a sound. The gray of the sky and sea looked cold, but a sickly warmth rose from the water. Despite this air, and though they had been told reaching the whale was a 2-day journey, he remained at the rail, clutching his wife's urn under his arm, and watched the horizon. He wondered how large the whale would be beside the boat, and how close they would get. His hope was to let her ashes fall in alongside the majestic creature. She had wanted so badly to be here on this trip, and this was as close to that wish as he could manage. He felt, in a way, like he was extending her journey. While he would only see the whale for a short time, she would travel all the vast oceans with this last great creature. He imagined the whale out there somewhere, alone in the listless sea, still calling for his long-lamented mate. How far, he wondered, would the whale's mournful song travel in the water? If he circled the globe, would this great and lonesome whale hear himself? That's it.